I am so excited to welcome Talia Lavin to our In Conversation series and making it through all of the technical issues that come with living in the internet world. Um, so let me get. So Talia is the author of Wild Faith, How the Christian Right is Taking Over America, and Culture Warlords, My Journey into the Dark Web of White Supremacy. She is a journalist who has had bylines in The New Yorker, The New Republic, The New York Times Review of Books, The Washington Post, and more. She also writes a newsletter, The Sword and the Sandwich, which is featured in Best American Food and Travel Writing 2024. I do just want to say before we get started that Wild Faith, and thus our discussion today, is going to touch on some difficult subjects, namely child abuse and sexual assault. So I encourage everyone to take care of themselves and do what you need to do. So if you need to step away during that portion, I won't be offended. Talia won't be offended. We're all good. So thank you so much, Talia, for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I moved literally yesterday, so the internet has been a bit of a like got it set up today, so it was a bit of a hiccup. I apologize for being late. So much for having me.
Well, it sounds like Isabel also just moved. Moving is a is a lot of work. Outside of that, how are you? How are you doing? How are you coming into today?
Uh oh, well, just peachy. It's wonderful out there. I love reading the news and just feeling so secure, so safe, knowing that ugh. How's anybody doing these days, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. So I gave you a very brief bio at the top, at the beginning. Is there anything else that you'd like to introduce yourself more fully before we get started?
Well, I have props. These are my books. This is the first one, and this is the most recent one. Um, they are both um about kind of the darker fringes and not even fringes anymore of American society and how they influence the landscape we find ourselves in now. Is that buzzing coming from me or you?
I don't know. I heard the little bit of muffledness.
Yeah, I think it's yeah. Whatever you did turned it off, so
Okay.
all is well. Yeah, and so and I know it's harder to be in a red state, really a lot harder, and I applaud all of your courage, and so thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. Can you share a little bit about how you came to write about white supremacy and Christian nationalism? I mean, both of your books are pretty, as you said, used to be fringes and now kind of mainstream, but how did you come to write about these issues?
Well, I started reporting on the far right around 2017 after the events in Charlottesville, Virginia. That was a point where I don't know what that is. Let me mute myself and see if okay. I think it's coming from his sun drop. Sorry. Or if someone else is unmuted, I don't know. Um, but anyway, yeah, no. So after the events in Charlottesville, Virginia, that was a moment where I, as a Jew in the US, was watching these chants of Jews will not replace us and really made me question a lot of complacency that I had. Um, and, I wanted to look deeper into what was happening. And it turns out that when you gaze into the abyss, particularly as like one of the members of a group, like of a group that abyss revile, they start looking at you. Um, and I sort of quickly and unpleasantly came to the attention of neo-Nazi myself. And being kind of a stubborn, stiff-necked person, I decided to dig in further and write a book. the sort of short, cleaned up version of this, involving a lot of stubbornness and anguish on my part, and that's how the first book came together. And then as to why I moved from kind of neo-Nazi chat room infiltration to more powerful mainstream institutions, I think for me, it began to feel like writing about sort of these consequential, and certainly their ideology is consequential, but ultimately kind of minor fringe figures, as their ideology became more mainstream, and as I began to examine the larger makeup of the right in general, I began to feel like writing about the fringes was no longer the best way to keep my audience informed and educated about what they were facing. So I
Yeah.
began to think about people closer to the center of power.
Yeah, I will say, as maybe can be inferred from my name, as a child of hippies, I did not grow up with a whole lot of contact with religion, and I found reading Wild Faith both eye-opening but also a little disturbing. I don't think I quite understood or realized how much power the Christian right had really built, and how, far in they had infiltrated into a lot of systems of power before reading it. So to start off, I would actually just love for you to share a little bit about what is the vision that the Christian right is building towards, and especially including an explanation of the Seven Mountain Mandate, which I was completely unfamiliar with before reading this book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can talk a little bit about like my background also. So I came to this subject. I grew up in a life like soaked in religion. I was grew up an Orthodox Jew in a very strictly religious household, a faith that I left. And so to me, the fact that my subjects, my interlocutors were like lived a life that was completely defined by religion wasn't alien at all. But many of the assumptions and many of the ideas were completely. So I came to it with the sense of I totally understand organizing your life around God and religious institutions, but let me understand their nature. Um, and it was within that and really examining the sort of very deliberate, very strategic accrual of power over half a century, um, that to me told the story of the Christian right and its emergence as one of the most significant power players in the American political. Um, yeah, I mean, it's just been so. It isn't to say that they've always been perfectly strategic or they're inhumanly, you know, sort of, like super powered or anything. They've made mistakes. They just keep going.
Right.
And the goal is sort of always more important. And there's looting and skimming and infighting and all sorts of things. But progress towards the goal is always sort of ultimately viewed as the most significant thing. Um, and so yeah, we see like multiplicity of tactics, we see tremendous, tremendous inroads into particularly the judiciary, but also all branches of power. I mean, at the moment, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is absolutely emblematic of so many of the concepts I write about in the book. And as to the Seven Mountains Mandate specifically, so that's um, the term that arises out of the charismatic movement, which is sort of a subset of the evangelical movement, more broadly. But the idea is that I think it's sort of previously taken from the verse of Isaiah, or at least gets its name from it. That there are seven mountains of influence in the culture, entertainment, politics, um, education, and so on. And that Christians should very deliberately choose to ascend the top of these mountains and exert control over these realms. And so the idea is that the secular underpinnings of American society, both in terms of culture and in terms of um, worldly power, should come under explicit theocratic control. And that's like a very, at this point, that doctrine has sort of been out there permeating the culture since the 90s, and it's become more and more of an explicit goal. And um, part of what we're seeing in the chaos that's happening right now is that mandate succeeding.
Yeah, I was really struck reading the book how many parallel institutions that the Christian right and evangelicals had built, everything from publishing companies to movie studios to supplement companies. It just really struck me all of the parallel institutions and how much power that the Christian right wields through those institutions.
Yeah. By the way, just is the did me turning off my air conditioner help?
Yes, you're much clearer all of a sudden.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of people say it's hard to hear. Just to make sure I still hear a kind of rumble, but I don't know what that would be.
Yeah, you're much clearer to me right now, so that's good. I don't know
Okay.
what the
I mean, I wouldn't ask anyone to imperil their life by turning off an AC in Arizona in the summer. Um, but if you have a fan or AC going, maybe turning that off would help too.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
So one particular institution that I think a lot of the CEBV community is interested in is CEBV is close partners with organizations that are really fighting for public education. And here in Arizona, that's often an uphill battle because, we're at ground zero of people who really want to do school vouchers and privatize schools. And also, like, Turning Point has a, huge presence here. In your book, and I know you wrote a recent piece in your newsletter, you talked about the decades-long opposition of many on the Christian right against the Department of Education. And I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about why the Christian right is so antagonistic towards the Department of Education, and particularly white evangelicals are so antagonistic towards this, public education as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to your previous question also about parallel institutions. Um, oh my God, what is this rumbling? Okay. Um, yeah, sorry. I think this is characteristic of a lot of subcultures. And one of the things that a lot of readers said is like, and something that I felt when I was really diving into this world is like, how could there be these things that are so sinister and so obvious and so widely adopted, like the Seven Mountain Mandate and sort of other pledges and so on that I just didn't know about? And the answer is because these were produced by parallel institutions for evangelicals by evangelicals. These marriage manuals, these books of prophecy, these sort of novels, these movies, they're not marketed to you. They're marketed towards people who are already within that community. So they're not secret per se. You can buy them on like Amazon or whatever, but you have to know who to look for. And unless you're in a church or community where that's part of the landscape and the air you breathe, it's very unlikely that you would find that on your own. And that's intentional. This is an insular culture to a degree. And yes, they evangelize and they win converts, but um, yeah. Um, at any rate, so Um, as far as the question about the Department of Education, I did want to answer that just because um the so a lot of people very understandably think that the issue that initially mobilized the Christian right um is abortion, just because they've been so vociferous about it. But in fact, there were, there's been like a white Protestant presence uh uh for a very long time, and there were people who for decades were trying to, in the 30s and the 40s, were trying to mobilize the sort of sleeping giant of the sort of white Baptist South, say, before, more contemporary terms like evangelical and more geographic movement meant that was less precise. um but the thing that ultimately woke the sleeping giant was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Um, the United States, first of all, passed Brown versus Board of Education, mandating equality in public education, and then began to enforce it and gave it a little bit of teeth, in the sense that there was another Supreme Court ruling, Green versus Kennedy in, I think, 1971, that took away tax funding for any religious school that was not integrated. So, in the interim, in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, throughout the South in particular, um, although it's not as if the North or the Southwest or the Northwest, was, not without racial tension. Um, there were entire counties where the public school systems essentially ceased to function. All the white students began to boycott schools, um, and the parents were not sending their kids to school. Instead, they sent them to parochial schools, Christian schools that were funded by white citizens councils, that were funded by white churches. And so if you look at the diaries and reports of NAACP field agents at the time, you repeatedly see over and over again these reports that say if it has church or Christian in the name, this is a segregation academy. These are schools that exist solely so that white kids can learn with white kids. And so by the 70s, the US sort of started to very mildly bite back, the government, and threaten tax exemptions. Bob Jones University, which was most famous for its, obstinate refusal to allow interracial dating, first interracial students and then interracial dating on campus, where George Bush like gave a speech, I think. Um, they lost their tax exemption as a charity. So that became the principal battleground. And it was only later in the mid 70s that there was sort of a common cause made between Catholics, for whom abortion had been a major issue, um, and and these sort of right-wing Protestants. There was a sense that the civil rights movement was more popular, that it was a losing fight. And some Catholic extremists who were quite politically savvy said, as late as 1973, the year that Roe v. Wade passed, the Southern Baptist Convention like passed a resolution saying abortion was fine. It was really like a totally Catholic issue, considered like kind of odd and not central at all by most Protestants, until this realignment of priorities, where you had these Catholic sort of very savvy figures like Phyllis Schlafly and Paul Weyrich, who were already sort of dreaming of a religious right, dreaming of a Christian right that had the kind of influence ours does today. Uh, and so like, um, at the end of the day, something that started as a protest against integration in education uh, morphed into something much larger, but never lost that focus. So if just to quickly sum up and answer your question, um, uh, you know, uh, segregated education and all white schools, parochial schools, homeschooling, whatever that looks like. But segregated education never stopped being a mainstay and a priority of the Christian right. And they have succeeded at dismantling the Department of Education after like 70 years after Brown versus Board.
Yeah.
That's where we're at right now.
Yeah, the attacks on education, I think the connection between the um, segregationist academies is something that I was not completely familiar with it being a Christian right issue, and then morphing into abortion. I think that was, yeah, a very illuminating history of our country. Another piece that I think was eye-opening and is related, I think, to education is the authoritarian nature of private life in a lot of Christian right households. Whether it's how, whether it's the marriage or whether it's how people are treating their children. And I know that for this book, you were able to interview a lot of folks who experienced abuse in evangelical homes. And you talk a lot about how that abuse and sort of the construction of family life is very related to the evangelical political worldview and sort of authoritarian political leanings. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. And also, I'm curious, like when you went in, did you have a sense that that connection was there, or was this just something you discovered along the way as you talked as you interviewed more folks?
Yeah. Sorry if my answers are a little rambling. There's just a lot to cover in a short
Yeah.
period of time. Um, Let me think about how to answer that clearly and concisely. So there are a couple of different things. I mean, first of all, just to go back to your prior question about education, um, the other reason, I mean, obviously the principal reason was this, racist control, and fierce, violent opposition to school integration. But another critical I believe, element to why there's been this relentless focus on child rearing and education. And you may have heard, particularly those of you who are involved directly in school board fights, this concept of um, parental rights over education, parental rights over what your kids are exposed to. This is a Christian right concept that was sort of test drove and used and is a very deliberate weapon on their part. So, it's something that's been adopted largely larger into the right-wing mainstream, but that's where it originated. This idea of a parent's right to control their child's education. So first of all, you have the sort of post-Brown integrated racial landscape. The other issue is that this movement towards quote unquote biblical parenting, by which I mean beating your kids a lot, beating your kids in sadistic, ritualistic ways, really arose in the 70s, again, in the wake of these 1960s social upheavals, these movements that were largely led by students. They were led by young people. They were led by passionate, impassioned young people. And that was ongoing into the 70s. You had feminism and gay rights and all these movements that were perceived of as a major threat by, these socially conservative Baptists. and, you know, evangelicals in general, and continue to be. Um, and they saw that it was a youth-led social revolution. So suddenly, as almost this counter-revolutionary measure, you see the rise of biblical parenting. And the person at the center of all that is one James Dobson, who really rose to fame on his books Dare to Discipline and The Strong-Willed Child. And something that I often have to explain to non-evangelical audiences is that the strong-willed child is a bad thing. And the goal of that book is to defeat your child's strong will, to break it. I cannot overestimate how many times in these books, breaking your child's will is written about over and over and over. And obedience is the chief virtue of a child, more than curiosity or intelligence or kindness or anything else. What you want is instant, unquestioning, snap your fingers obedience. And these books are about how to instill that. And the answer is largely physical violence. So, you know, the idea is like parents these days are too soft. I guess the 50s was like a really wild, loose decade for parenting. And so we have to return to biblical parenting, for which they trot out like Proverbs 13, essentially as like the only biblical couching of all this. And um, so I've read so many of these books, these evangelical child rearing manuals, um, God, the Rod and Your Child's Bod, To Train Up a Child, the Biblical Book of Child Rearing, and so on. And yes, I own a copy of God, the Rod and Your Child's Bod, and I feel very weird about it. Like the cover image is like a kid like eating a cookie from the cookie jar, and it's like, oh, I'm gonna beat that kid with a stick because of God. Yeah, so I got a little off track. It makes me angry. It makes me really angry.
It is horrific. I mean, it's just straight up horrific. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I've heard of blanket training. So blanket training, Kathy, comes from the Pearls, who wrote To Train Up a Child, which I wouldn't recommend anyone read if you like have a child, were a child, want a child, have a child in your life, and want to like not cry, because I did. But yeah, blanket training is something that the Duggars, of 19 Kids and Counting engaged in. It's essentially when your child is a baby and during tummy time, what you do is you put them on a blanket and then you put something shiny or distracting right off the boundaries of the blanket. And then every time they reach for the thing that they want, you hit them. Not necessarily hard, but this is an infant, you know, this is a tummy time infant, not even like fully crawling yet. And what you're teaching them from that age is curiosity is bad. I'm in control and I will give you physical pain if you express curiosity. So, and Dobson is sort of the moderate one for saying like, start hitting your kid around 15 months. Um, you know, which is very young. I mean, this is still a baby, right? So I may have forgotten the contours of your original question because I got.
I was just how short that line is between the this abusive family theory of parenting and that line between that and support for authoritarianism and fascism. Like, just it really just struck me how clear that line was. So I was just curious, you talk a lot about it in the book, if you could just expand on that. And also, like, did you know that that was where you were going when you started
Yeah,
interviewing all these folks?
I'm so sorry. When I start talking about like blanket training, I get like, you know, like cartoon like steam whistle like rage coming out my ears and forget like the niceties of like say a three-part question. Yeah, I mean, so I wanted to say, first of all, it originated in authoritarianism. The biblical parenting movement originated in this authoritarian impulse to sort of undo the social movements of the 60s. So it's not divorced from it from the beginning to the end, right? Um, but one book that I found very helpful was a book called For Your Own Good, by Alice Miller, who was a psychologist and also a Holocaust survivor, who essentially set out to analyze like how did German pedagogy methods contribute to like the rise of Nazism and its large scale adoption in the populace. And what was really striking to me is that her examples of fin de siècle German pedagogy were so familiar to me from reading these evangelical parenting manuals. This obsession with obedience, this obsession with physical violence. I mean, it was almost word for word, right? And so there was really this very significant line. And what she writes is that when you create a child whose principal value is their obedience, when you create a child who is conditioned to empathize with the aggressor, conditioned to view weakness as something that is contemptible, conditioned to both expect violence and to confuse love with violence and to both endure and admire punishment. These are people who create the best torturers. That's what she writes. And so for me, looking at these parenting manuals through that lens, I mean, it's very like the family structure that's described with the father sort of having absolute control over everybody, his headship and biblical masculine authority covering over all. The mother is sort of the co-enforcer, but also, submissive to him. The mother kind of having control of the children but ultimately under the spiritual authority of her husband. I read a lot of Christian marriage manuals too, and that gets the cartoon kettle steam going too. There's a lot to say about that, but let's talk about kids. I mean, to me, how you treat kids is how you treat your future, right? And that's hackneyed and it's cliche, but what do you want out of the future? You want people who are unquestioningly obedient.
Right.
You want people who, when you snap, they jump. People who believe that they were beaten because God said so, and that's a good reason to do just about anything. They were people who, from infancy, had their primary relationships shaped by physical violence in the name of God. So you ask me how that's connected to authoritarianism. That is authoritarianism. And that's how you create authoritarian subjects, people who are primed towards authoritarianism, is by raising them in, one of the men I talked to about what being a Christian husband and being raised to be a Christian husband was like for him before he left that community. It's like, I was raised to be a petty tyrant. I was raised to be in absolute control.
Right.
And so when you enact 10 million petty tyrannies around the country, you create a lot of people who grow up under tyranny, and are conditioned for tyranny, accept it, love it, have it as part of their identities. So to me, every part of the biblical parenting movement lends itself towards authoritarianism, from its political origins to what it has wrought on, at this point, 50 years of people, children, to the present day. And yeah, I mean, to me, the current sort of open, willing acceptance of authoritarianism among the multitude of the Christian right, with people sort of with minimal dissent, let's say, is because these family units are authoritarianism factories.
I think one of the other things that struck me again was, again, the mainstream, how much of that parenting and marriage advice has seeped into mainstream culture, whether it's, parents' rights now is everyone talks about it, or you mentioned a bunch of the like marriage manuals. I forget which one is like, has sort of become mainstream, right? Like a lot of those concepts have infiltrated out, um, which just sort of further primes the ground, right, for more and more people to have that lived experience of authoritarianism at home. And thus, it doesn't feel so weird when it happens out in public.
Yeah, I mean, it's still quite an insular movement, but I would say the rise of sort of the trad wife as a social media icon is emblematic of, yeah, like the renewed popularity of these ideas, or at least the fact that the last 10 years of American politics have been so dominated by misogyny that internalized misogyny becomes sort of this fetish trend, something that dominates TikTok, that you can't open social media without seeing, people like very, I think to me it's like primarily fetish content, if you had to ask. Like these videos are for men. I don't think they're for women. Um, but it conditions men to expect certain things from women, that they're less than people, right? Um, which coincidentally, everything else in society also primes men to accept
Right.
and expect.
Yeah. I think like one of the things that is striking to me is, these are very rigid, clear definitions of like family and sexual behavior and relationships. And yet the chosen leader is Donald Trump, who doesn't follow any of that, right? Like he does not fit into any of these narrow ideas of family and marriage. So, what's the appeal of him? Like, why has he been chosen by the Christian right when he so clearly doesn't align with any of their kind of moral lines?
I think the last time this was a really big question was 2015. No one was more surprised by Ted Cruz than Ted Cruz. He's like, "What are you talking about? I'm an evangelical. I've been an evangelical all my life, and you guys are abandoning me for this guy, right?" Like the last time this really shook out in public was in the 2015 GOP primary. Um, at the time, there were some interesting rationales for like, particularly after the grab them by the pussy tape. Um, uh, for why, for why Donald Trump. One of the fascinating ones, again, came out of the charismatic, prophetic tradition of evangelical Christianity. There's an idea that's very persistent in Christian morality, that God uses unlikely tools. God uses whatever tool there is to hand. And so there was this idea that like, this is God's flawed vessel. Um, and in particular, one of the sort of soi-disant prophets, Lance Wallnau, had pointed out that um, in Isaiah 40, Trump was going to be the 45th president, and in Isaiah 45, Isaiah 45 describes the Emperor Cyrus, who was a Persian heathen who nonetheless allowed the Second Temple to be built. And so, it's all these like textual connections, numbers, blah, blah, blah. But it was this idea that like, this is the heathen who will see God's, vision come to pass. I think ever since then, it's just been more of a question of like, Trump knows what side his bread is buttered. He knows he needs these people. Go out and vote for him. And um, and he gave them what they wanted, a Supreme Court majority, and Roe v. Wade overturned.
Right.
And so once someone has rendered their willingness to do your bidding, or, you know, so obvious, and claimed your goals as their triumph, it's not particularly that much of a mystery. That, and I think racism and misogyny are like really core parts of the Christian right's overall like ideologies. So that everything else winds up boiling down to cosmetic differences.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a man getting divorced is much less of a catastrophe in the moral world of the Christian right than a woman getting divorced.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it was always appealing to this group. These seeing their values like reflected in a different way. You know, Trump got 80% of the evangelical vote in 2020, 84% in 2024. I mean, these are
Right.
solid numbers.
Right.
Like it's overwhelming support. And when you look at like Pew Research and the overall sort of social value scape of the evangelical right, the white Christian right, there's total alignment. But yeah, I mean, but like Mike Johnson is Speaker of the House, Mike Pence was the VP. There was always this sort of concession to the evangelical right of like, I may be a vulgarian, but I'm your vulgarian, right?
Right.
But as I said, I think the last time this was a really relevant question beyond aesthetics, or like required evangelicals to do serious self-justification was 2015.
So I hear, like, when I read the book and started telling people about it, I've heard from many people where people are like, oh, these are not real Christians. They're perverting Christianity. And I feel like in your book, you kind of make an argument that it's a mistake to frame the Christian right as not real Christians or as a perversion of Christianity. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
I mean, this is like a largely unwinnable fight to me. Like I have to like liberal Christians about it. Like I have about as much luck with that as like being like, when you call each other Pharisees to insult one another, like you're really just saying like, oh, we're like the Jews, gross. Or like, like insulting each other as usurers. Oh, we're like Jews, disgusting. I think there's a lot of like, there are a lot of assumptions like that you get to have when you're a hegemonic religion or just like part of hegemony of any kind,
Mhm.
that um other people don't. Like I don't get to like disclaim like Jeffrey Epstein or Bibi Netanyahu or like people who, or Alan Dershowitz, like people who like stand opposed to every single value I have and be like, they're not real Jews. Like I don't get to do that.
Right.
Um, that's not within my power to do, right? So to me, it feels a bit like an abdication of responsibility. I mean, the other thing that it does, I mean, I'm Jewish, right? I'm not a Christian.
Right.
I don't equate Christianity with morality. And there's this explicit assumption that like, if you do Christianity right, you are being a perfect moral being. And like we call ourselves followers of Jesus and we're doing it right. And like, didn't they read the Sermon on the Mount? I'm like, yeah, they did. They make like textual arguments all the time. They just interpret it differently than you. And if you're saying that like Christianity equates with perfect moral behavior, like what do you say about the Crusades? Or what
Right.
do you say about pogroms? Like how far back does this go? Like the only people who were perfectly moral were like Jesus and his disciples, I think that for me, I mean, again, like this is like I just think there are a lot, and maybe not real Christian. Like someone pointed out to me recently, but like they're like a Midwestern Christian, and like saying like you're not a real Christian is like basically saying you're a heretic, you're an apostate. And I just want to hear those words. I'm like, do a schism, like have a fight.
Right.
Don't just be like you guys, like say you're doing it wrong. Like don't say you're not real Christians. You're, like to me it felt, at least when I was like when I've been confronted with um this terminology over and over again, it feels like a defense of like Jesus and his brand rather than like, the people who are impacted by these policies. Like I'm like, okay, great, like rescue Christianity, like, but like maybe you should worry about like women dying of sepsis or like kids being beaten instead of like defending Christianity's honor.
Yeah.
It seems like a little bit of a perversion of priorities to me, but like I don't know how Christian schisms work. And if this is the beginnings of one, like go ahead, please.
Right.
Like the
Yeah. I
Reformation
think-
wars were a long time ago.
Yeah.
Like maybe we're due for another.
Yeah. Yeah, I think focusing on the people who are harmed is always a good place to start, and not the folks that are causing the harm. I know coming up on the end of time. So before my last question, I
Coming
do
up on the end of time feels like
under time for this conversation. End of
feels
time
like
in
also
general was
also
an
after time.
unintentional. That was an unintentional.
But like for more about the Christian rights views on the apocalypse, Wild Faith has a lot to say. They are hastening it.
Yes, absolutely. I do just want to, and maybe Isabel, you can drop a link. In addition to writing books, you have a newsletter, The Sword and the Sandwich, which I'm a subscriber to, and I recommend everyone else. Partially because I'm a sucker for exploring history through and hidden histories through like seemingly mundane parts of society, and I love the like, let's talk about history with a sandwich. Let's. But before my last question, I know there's some other exciting things coming up for the sword and the sandwich. Do you just want to do a little plug for what's coming up?
Yeah, so I mean, I do write about politics twice a month. Like cool, let me drag myself through this hellmire that I've been like mining for a decade. And write about it, hopefully in a coherent, usually like florid and very emotional way. But then every Friday I get to write about a different sandwich from Wikipedia's list of notable sandwiches. I would say you have to have both. Like, I've spent a lot of time staring into very dark places. Um, from neo-Nazi chat rooms to child abuse manuals and like spending day after day after day after day talking to people about the worst moments of their childhoods in the name of God. And that can take a toll on you as a writer. It can take a toll on you as a reader. But when you were writing it, when you were producing the material and living it, you really have to work very hard to find balance and not feel like you're in sort of an airless sphere of like horror all the time. And so for me, I made this very conscious decision of like, there's going to be a sandwich. At the end of the week, I'm going to drop everything and like throw every single resource I have into like writing like a comprehensive history of like the pastrami sandwich. And like where did it come from and like what does it mean to me? And I recently signed a contract with Simon and Schuster, and I'm turning those essays into a book, and so that's very exciting. And I get to like take my head out of like the like crusted asshole of humanity's worst instincts and just like write about something different. But otherwise I'm an expert in the crusted asshole of humanity's worst instincts. And given that we are all of us living in the shadow of that crusted asshole, it is useful. And I hope if anything from this talk was edifying to any of you, feel free to, get in touch. I'm at taliaLavinWrites@gmail.com. And please do consider checking out the audiobook. It's the book, and if you enjoyed the dulcet sounds of my voice. I did read the audiobook and I did little voices. Uh,
Thank you so much. And I do appreciate you bringing in the we have to figure out the boundaries, and for when we're looking into the crusted asshole, we need to find the boundaries to keep ourselves sane. I appreciate you naming that it's important to find those practices because otherwise we just kind of fall down the pit and can't take action. And just finally, you say in your book, like I think in the final chapter, that this Christian right movement isn't going to abate until the public at large pushes back, and creates a counter zeal to this religiously zealous movement. And I'm just curious on what your thoughts of what that looks like. What are the actions, large or even very, very small, like writing a newsletter, but like what are the actions you think folks on our call or in general could take that helps create that counter zeal, to push back against the Christian right movement?
I mean, it's always, there is an inherent difficulty in that this is a movement that has developed like a brutal sense of discipline, right? Through the methods discussed earlier. This is a movement that is largely homogenous and is working towards greater social homogeneity. This is a movement that has a certain unity of purpose, whereas their opponents, of necessity and as a matter of sort of, I think the nature of like just how overweening this idea of like reshaping America in the image of like the narrowest and most brutal like versions of Christianity is. Like we're a diverse, complex panoply. And it's hard to assemble us into like the serried ranks of an army in the same way. And so that's not what I propose. Like, let's be like this, embrace like the chaos of what we are as a countervailing force, right? Embrace that we're gay and we're trans and we're, not white in a variety of different ways, or that we're Jews or whatever we are. We're just like women who don't want to be, who don't dream of like being pregnant for 20 years while like under the headship of their husband. You know, we are a cacophony, right? And a cacophony can drown out a disciplined tune if we work hard enough, if we're loud enough. And when I say to folks, and largely the book is an exercise in like, know your enemy, don't underestimate them. This is not a book of tactics.
Right.
Lots of other people have written about tactics. I'm no general tacticist. My principal tactic here is don't underestimate, no matter how wacky it seems, don't laugh. Know that this is like deadly serious for them. And so you should like recognize that quality. But I would say like what you can do is what you can do and what you're inclined to do, whether that's like making art, whether that's street protest, in my case, it's writing and speaking, um, whether you're like someone who's gonna wheat paste, anti-regime slogans around town, like that's great. Whether you're someone who's gonna show up at every school board meeting and take notes and like bring your friends to like fight anti-trans motions, like that's amazing. Everything we do is part of the cacophony of fighting back. And it looks like a million different actions by millions of different people, as long as we do what we can. And don't ever feel like you're contributing less than you ought if you are contributing what you can.
I love that the diverse and vibrant cacophony is going to drown it out. I think that's a fabulous image. I love that. Thank you, Talia. So thank you so much for spending your evening with us. I really appreciate this, and I really encourage folks to go read the book. I read it and then read like three fiction books afterwards to recover. Um,
This is why
because
I'm reading the sandwich book. I'm so tired. I have I feel it's vital. I feel it's important, and I encourage all of you to read it, or at least buy it. You can use it as a doorstop or for your wobbly table. Use literally anything but a paddle to spank your children, because that's the one non-acceptable use for it. But like, God, I'm like so excited to write about sandwiches and not have a like, I read your book and it gave me nightmares, but like, thank you. I
Well,
read
I
your
look forward to reading about sandwiches in a
like
few
I read
months.
your book. I couldn't sleep for 3 nights, but like, thank you. I'm like, are you okay? Like I'm like, ah, no, are any of us okay? But like, I was proud. One thing that I would say the thing I'm proudest of this book, and really what was the core and the inspiration, was just talking to survivors of this specific brand, widespread brand of child abuse in the name of God. And so many of them were like so moved that someone from outside their community cared. It felt validating to them that someone else would look like read James Dobson, take the time, read
Mhm.
James Dobson, read the Pearls, like listen to what they had to say and care. And like ex-evangelicals are the people who've been shouting the loudest about this stuff for a very long time.
Right.
And so their voices, like through, you know, just like listening and caring and writing about it in as human and empathetic a way I could. Like to me, that was the way I could contribute. Um, and so if you find that, a meaningful idea, I hope that you'll, have a chance to look at their testimony, which was hard won and hard fought and hard spoken.
Thank you so much, Talia, for this conversation. I think it's been very illuminating, and educational, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening, unpacking and moving in.
Yes. Take care and stay cool, everybody.
All right. You have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Bye.